Hi, I'm Dr. Sheetal Ujmani. I'm a pediatrician, best-selling author, Ayurveda lifestyle consultant, yoga instructor, and your host for the Healthy and Happy Lifestyle Summit. Today, I'm talking about how to create community in the time of COVID. A few months ago, we became familiar with the term social distancing, a necessary action on our part to relieve strain on the medical system during this global pandemic. And while this is critically important and continues to be so, this public health measure also gives rise to social isolation and loneliness. Now, I think it's important to note that social isolation is not the same as loneliness. You can be alone but not feel lonely. You may have also experienced situations where you are around many people and yet you feel lonely. So loneliness and social isolation are not interchangeable or mutually exclusive. But certainly there is an increased risk for developing loneliness during this time of physical distancing. So how can you create community, find fulfillment, and find joy in your relationships during this time? That's what I'm going to address today. First, I'm going to review why this is important. How does social connection affect your health? Then I'm going to give you practical actions that you can take to start to cultivate fulfilling relationships today, even now with the challenges of the current pandemic. So first, why is this important? As humans, we're hardwired for social connection. Oxytocin is a hormone that your body naturally produces. Your body produces oxytocin through physical touch. So it's the hormone responsible for making you feel good when you get a hug from someone. It's also the hormone that increases in new moms that helps them bond with their babies. When your body releases oxytocin, you feel calm, content, and secure. You also have a neurotransmitter called dopamine. This increases when you fall in love. It's one of your feel-good hormones. You may have heard of the dopamine reward pathway because it's also pertinent in addiction, which explains the addictive quality of new love. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter, and it decreases when you fall in love in those early stages. And decreased levels of serotonin are associated with obsessive compulsive disorder. So that explains that sense of obsession that you get when you're newly in love. What also happens is your amygdala becomes less reactive. The amygdala is a structure in your brain that detects and responds to threats and fear. Hence, love is blind. When you fall in love, you let your guard down. When you feel you're in a loving, secure relationship, you move out of that fight or flight response into a sense of calm and security. So you can see that on a biological level, you're hardwired for social connection. So knowing that, now how do your relationships affect your health? Loneliness and social isolation are known risk factors for coronary heart disease and stroke. Poor quality or quantity of relationships is also related to a decreased immune function and cognitive decline. We often see people who are living in toxic environments develop psychosomatic symptoms. What that means is physical symptoms such as chronic pain directly related to the emotional stress that they're facing. The risk for mortality due to loneliness is similar to the risk of mortality from light daily smoking and greater than the risks of mortality from hypertension and obesity. There are a few suggested pathways for how loneliness affects your health. One proposed pathway is that positive social connections also promote healthy behaviors. For example, if you're engaged in a community that values exercise and nutrition, then you most likely will too. If your friends don't smoke, you're less likely to smoke. If you're hanging out with people, say in this Facebook group, who are focused on building healthy and happy habits, you'll probably start to adopt those habits in your lifestyle as well. Conversely, if you're engaging with toxic people, or if you're feeling lonely and isolated, then you're more likely to engage in harmful lifestyle behaviors. Another proposed mechanism is that loneliness leads to increased stress. We know that chronic stress, so stress over long periods of time, can lead to greater inflammation in your body. And we also know that inflammation is at the root of many chronic illnesses. So those are a couple of proposed mechanisms of how loneliness and social isolation can affect your health. Something else that I find fascinating is the blue zones. So this was a large-scale epidemiologic study done by National Geographic and the National Institute of Aging. What they did is they identified communities that have the most centenarians. Centenarians are people who live beyond the age of 100. And not only do these areas of the world have the most centenarians, people who live beyond the age of 100, but they're active and well, living active lifestyles. So after they identified these 5 parts of the world, they studied different aspects of their lifestyles, and they found a few similarities and pillars that remained consistent among these communities. Many of those pillars are similar to what we're talking about this week: food, movement, stress management, community. So I'm going to focus on community for this talk. They found that a sense of belonging and community was one of the main pillars correlated with longevity. I also love that in Okinawa, Japan, which is one of the communities that was identified by the Blue Zones, they have something called Moai. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but the idea of this is that you're given a set of 5 friends who are friends for life. Your family identifies these friends for you when you're an infant, and you grow up with these friends. You see or talk to these friends almost daily for your entire life. They're intimately connected and part of each other's lives, and I just love that. I mean, my closest friends and I go back over 20 years now, and I think that's really, really special. But I can't even imagine being born into a community where that friendship is ingrained from infancy. Also interesting, in the Blue Zone communities, many have 3 or more generations of family members living together: grandparents, parents, children, great-grandparents. And they found improved health outcomes not only for the elderly population, so the grandparents and great-grandparents, but also for the children. As a pediatrician, I found that fascinating. So just to recap what we've talked about so far: 1, you're hardwired for social connection. That being said, I wanted to mention, if you find that you're having a hard time with all of the physical distancing measures that are in place, please have grace for yourself. As a human being, you are hardwired for that social connection, and so that is an additional challenge of this current time. But I will give you some tips to help you with that. So that was the first point we talked about, is that you're hardwired for social connection. The second thing we talked about so far is that positive social connection leads to improved outcomes in your health, happiness, and longevity. So now, you may be asking, great, so how do I do this? How do I build community, especially in a time of a pandemic? So I'm going to give you a framework to look at this. I got this initial basic framework from Dr. Vivek Murthy. He was a recent guest on Brene Brown's podcast called Unlocking Us. He recently released a book called Together. I haven't read the book yet, but that's what this podcast was talking about. And this book is all about loneliness. So in this interview, Dr. Murthy described 3 types of relationships. Intimate, so your relationship with your significant other. And I realize you may or may not have a significant other in your life at this time. So I always like to include your closest family members as well. Or if you're not close with your family, then maybe that best friend who's like your sister. And then the second type of relationship is relational, and that includes your friendships. And then the third type is collective, and that's community. So for example, if you belong to a faith-based group or the community at your local yoga studio or anything like that. So that's the basic framework that Dr. Murthy had presented. And I'm going to add a fourth one in there, and that is the relationship to yourself. And I think your relationship to yourself is perhaps the most important of all. It is the foundation for all of the other relationships in your life. So it's important to have interactions and feel connection through all four of those areas. And that's why sometimes you can say, well, I have a great husband, but I still feel lonely if you're not, say, part of a community. Or vice versa. You could say, I have great friends and a community, but I feel lonely. I don't have a significant other in my life. And so you really need to find a way to feel fulfilled in all four of these areas. So I have some homework for you. I want you to grab a pen and a paper. So I have a sheet of paper here, and I want you to make 4 columns. I want you to label them self, intimate, relational, and collective. So I'm going to hold up my paper so that you can see it. So hopefully you can see that there. So basically what I did is I took my paper, I folded in half, and then I fold it in half again. So that gives me my 4 columns. And then at the top of each column, I wrote headings: self, intimate, relational, and collective. Under the column titles, I want you to write down how often it's important for you to connect on those levels. So for example, for me, it's important to connect with myself multiple times a day. So I wrote that down multiple times a day. It's important for me to connect with those people in my life who I consider intimate, in my intimate circle, at least once a day, to have a true, heartfelt, genuine connection. Relational, so my friendships, it's important for me to connect with my friends at least once a week. So I'm writing down the minimums, what's kind of the least that I feel like I need to feel fulfilled and joyful. And then the final column, collective. So that's your community. And so I wrote down once a month. So you may have a different time frame and time reference there on your sheet of paper, and that's okay. We all have different needs with regards to how often we need to connect. Then in the respective columns, I want you to list all of the different ways that you can think of to connect in those areas. So I'll give you some examples to help you get started. So for example, in the self column, so what are some ways that you can connect with yourself? So for me, that would be things like meditation, going outside for a walk, journaling, doing a gratitude practice, reading a book. So those are just a few examples for me. What are some ways that you can connect with yourself? So I want you to fill that in your first row. In the second row, for intimate, what are some ways that you can cultivate true, heartfelt, genuine connection in your intimate relationship, either with your significant other or your closest family members or that best friend who's just like family? So that could be some examples, maybe committing to 5 to 10 minutes of complete undivided attention, of asking your partner how they are doing that day. Planning activities to spend quality time together. I think a great framework when looking at trying to come up with ideas on how to connect in terms of your intimate relationships is really looking at the 5 love languages. So if you're not familiar with that, there is a book about the 5 love languages. There's a website as well. But basically those 5 love languages are words of affirmation, physical touch, quality time, gifts, and acts of service. And that's a great framework to just kind of help you start to think of ideas and ways to connect in that area. And then the third column, friendships, relational. So how can you connect with your friends? So in this current time of the pandemic and physical distancing, that may be through a phone call or scheduling a Zoom call or FaceTime. It could be that you commit to send a text to one new friend each week. It could be to send a care package. I actually had two dear friends send me care packages just in the past week, and it was very meaningful and a really beautiful way to connect and feel close to those friends who live some distance away, where at this current time I can't travel to go see. So that's a lovely idea as well. So for the fourth column, collective, community, what are some ways that you can connect with your community? I found Facebook groups like this one to be really helpful. And if you do use social media as a way to connect with community, I encourage you to find ways to actively engage. So comment, develop relationships with maybe some people who you see posting frequently in the same Facebook group, so that way you can actually cultivate some friendships. I have actually cultivated some true, genuine friendships through Facebook groups, but it does require being actively engaged. So if you don't leave comments or things like that, then it may be harder to connect in that way. And specifically, I find the groups to be helpful because you can join a group with like-minded interests. And so you have a higher likelihood of truly, genuinely connecting with someone there. Meetup groups. So meetup groups are great. Obviously, in this time of physical distancing, the in-person events are limited. But I'll give you an example. I joined a writing meetup group before the pandemic hit, and we would meet about once a week in a coffee shop and write together and chat. And so this meetup group has switched over to a virtual space. And so we still meet. We meet over a virtual hangout space, video chat space, and we chat and we write together still about once a week. So you can still use meetup groups. Other ideas for connecting with community, faith-based activities with your church or temple, or community service. So there is also science behind how beneficial it is to your well-being and how it affects your body, mind, and spirit to give. So generosity of spirit and community service does have beneficial impacts on your well-being as well. So that's another wonderful way, and especially during this time, during this very challenging time, there are many opportunities to provide service. So these are all just ideas. Like I mentioned before, once you start consciously thinking about it, your mind naturally starts to seek out creative and innovative ways for you to connect. So to recap, today you learned that you're hardwired for social connection, that positive social connection has a positive impact on your health, happiness, and longevity. Third, there are 4 levels of relationships: self, intimate, relational, and collective. And lastly, you came up with a plan to help you connect on all 4 of those levels. So I really hope you enjoyed this talk and that you got a lot out of it. Please leave a comment below letting me know your biggest takeaways from this session. I hope you've been enjoying the summit so far. We still have a few more great presentations lined up for you, including, if you want to learn more about this topic specifically, we have Dr. Khalsa talking more about cultivating loving relationships tomorrow. So enjoy the rest of the summit, be well, and see you soon.